I don't know why I went back to that part of the forest, the one locals always talk around but never about, the one that doesn't show up on maps even though everyone knows exactly where it is, like the woods themselves refuse to be documented. I'd heard the stories, strange lights, missing hikers, the feeling of being followed by something that never quite steps into view, but I'd always chalked it up to folklore, the kind of tales people tell to keep kids from wandering too far. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and mine has always been louder than my common sense, so I packed light, left early, and hiked deeper than I ever had before. The air changed first. It wasn't colder or warmer, just different, like stepping into a room where someone had been arguing moments before, the tension still clinging to the walls. The trees grew taller, straighter, too uniform for nature, and the forest floor was strangely clean, no fallen branches, no underbrush, just a smooth carpet of dead leaves that muffled every step. I found a clearing just before dusk, perfectly circular, as if carved out intentionally, and even though every instinct told me to keep walking, I set up camp in the center, telling myself I was imagining the way the trees seemed to lean inward. The fire crackled weakly, struggling to stay lit even with dry wood, and the smoke rose straight up in a thin, unnatural column, like the air refused to let it drift. As night settled, the silence thickened until it felt like a weight pressing against my ears. No insects, no wind, no distant rustling, just the soft, steady sound of my own breathing. I tried to distract myself by making tea, but the water refused to boil, trembling at the edge of a simmer as if something was holding it back. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't moving wrong, they were moving too right, too synchronized, like the trees were breathing in unison. I stared at them until my eyes watered, trying to convince myself it was just the fire playing tricks, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became that the shadows were responding to me, shifting subtly whenever I shifted, leaning closer whenever I blinked. I retreated into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there in the dark, listening to the silence pulse around me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt strange. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping on the ground just outside the tent. Not footsteps, not an animal, but a slow, patient tap, 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 like someone drumming their fingers on the earth. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It circled the tent, tapping in irregular patterns, sometimes close enough that I could feel the vibration through the ground, sometimes farther away, as if whatever it was kept losing interest and then remembering me again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, praying the tapping wouldn't turn into something else. Eventually, it stopped, replaced by a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the air like the forest was whispering in a language too old to understand. I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to pale morning light and the smell of damp earth. When I stepped outside, the clearing was different. The trees were closer, noticeably closer, leaning inward like they'd spent the night creeping toward me. The fire pit was gone, not scattered or kicked over, just gone, replaced by a perfect circle of bare earth. And in the center of that circle was a small object, a piece of wood, carved into a spiral, smooth and warm as if it had been held recently. I didn't touch it. I packed my gear in minutes, refusing to look at the trees, even though I could feel them watching. The trail back was wrong. Landmarks were missing, paths curved in directions they shouldn't, and the forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. At one point, I turned around and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing I'd left behind, tall, still, featureless, like a shadow that had learned how to stand upright. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being followed never left. When I finally reached my car, the sun was high, but the forest behind me was dark, as if the shadows refused to let go. I drove home in silence, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream, but when I unpacked my bag, the carved spiral was sitting neatly on top of my clothes, warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike. I don't go near the woods. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels too still, I hear that soft tapping again, slow, patient, like something that found me once and knows it can find me again. I'd been camping alone for years, always chasing the quiet, the kind of silence that only lives deep in the woods where cell signals die and the sky feels heavier. But this trip was different from the start. Something about the trail felt off, like the forest had shifted slightly since the last time I'd been there, like the trees had rearranged themselves while no one was watching. I set up camp near a shallow creek, the kind that barely moved but still made enough sound to mask the absence of birdsong, and as I unpacked, I noticed the ground was unusually soft, not muddy, just yielding, like it didn't want to hold weight. The trees around me were tall and straight, but their bark was darker than usual, almost black in places, and some of them had deep vertical scars that didn't look natural. I built a fire, boiled water, and tried to settle in, but the forest wouldn't let me. Every time I looked up, I felt like something had just moved out of sight, like the branches were still swaying from a presence that had vanished a second too soon. I told myself it was just nerves, that I'd been working too hard and needed rest, but the feeling didn't fade, it sharpened. Around midnight, the fire began to dim, not from lack of fuel, but as if the flames were being pulled downward, shrinking unnaturally fast. I added more wood, but the fire refused to grow, flickering weakly like it was afraid to be seen. That's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, not footsteps, not animal movement, but something heavier, slower, like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. I froze, listening, trying to locate the source, but it wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere, vibrating through the soil, pulsing beneath me. I backed into the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there in the dark, counting the beats, waiting for them to stop. But they didn't. They just kept going, steady and patient, like something was waiting for me to fall asleep. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of the creek. Only it wasn't babbling anymore. It was whispering. I know how that sounds, but I swear the water was speaking, not in words, but in cadence, like a voice trying to form syllables through liquid. I stepped outside, and the forest was wrong. The trees were closer. Not all of them, just a few, but enough to notice. The scars on their bark had deepened, widened, and one of them had a fresh mark, long, jagged, and dripping something dark that wasn't sap. I turned to the creek and saw that the water was still, perfectly still, like glass, and in its reflection I saw something standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Just fog. Just silence. But the reflection remained, rippling slightly, as if whatever was behind me had moved. I didn't pack. I didn't eat. I just grabbed my flashlight and started walking not toward the trail but away from the creek, away from the clearing, away from whatever had decided I was worth watching. The forest didn't fight me, but it didn't help either. The path was unfamiliar, even though I'd hiked this area dozens of times. Landmarks were gone. Fallen logs, I remembered, were missing. The air grew colder, thicker, and the thumping returned, louder now, faster, like it was chasing me. I ran. I don't know how far or how long, but eventually I stumbled into a new clearing, smaller, tighter, surrounded by trees that bent inward like a cage. In the center was a stone, smooth and flat, with a single object placed on top. My flashlight. The one I was still holding. I dropped it instantly, but the thumping stopped. The forest went silent again, but not empty, expectant. I didn't touch the stone. I didn't retrieve the flashlight. I just turned and walked, slower this time, letting the forest guide me, and somehow, eventually, I found the trail. When I emerged from the woods, the ranger station was empty, the parking lot deserted, and my car had a thin layer of frost on the windshield, even though it was early fall. I drove home without speaking, without thinking, and when I unpacked, I found something tucked into my sleeping bag, a strip of bark, twisted into a spiral, warm to the touch, and pulsing faintly, like it had a heartbeat of its own. I keep it in a drawer now, wrapped in cloth, buried beneath old gear I'll never use again. I haven't gone camping since. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the lights are off, I hear the whisper of water and the slow, steady thump of something remembering me. The trail had been abandoned for years, according to the ranger who half-jokingly warned me not to bother with it, said it was more mood than map, and that if I wanted solitude, I'd find it there, but maybe not the kind I was looking for. That should have been enough to steer me elsewhere, but something about the way he said it stuck with me, like he knew something but couldn't say it outright. So I went, hiking deep into the woods where the trees grew too close together and the light barely touched the ground. The air felt heavier the farther I walked, like the forest was thick with something old, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I found a clearing just before dusk, a strange oval of bare earth surrounded by trees that leaned inward slightly, as if they'd been watching the spot for years. I pitched my tent, built a fire, and tried to shake the feeling that I'd stepped into a place that didn't want me there. The silence was unnatural, not peaceful, but hollow, like the forest had emptied itself of sound on purpose. As night fell, the firelight cast long shadows that didn't behave the way they should. They stretched too far, bent at odd angles, and sometimes flickered even when the flames were still. I told myself it was just the terrain, the uneven ground, the tricks of light and fatigue. But then I noticed something else. The trees around the clearing weren't just leaning. They were twisted, subtly warped, like they'd grown around something invisible. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just wind damage or age, but the pattern was too deliberate. I turned in early, zipped the tent shut, and lay there listening to the silence press against the nylon walls. Around midnight, I heard a sound that didn't belong, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like something dragging across bark. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, somewhere just beyond the fire's reach. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It circled slowly, pausing every few minutes, then starting again. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I just lay there, heart pounding, counting the seconds between each scrape. Eventually, it faded, replaced by a low hum. Not mechanical, not natural, just a steady vibration in the air, like the forest itself was resonating. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke to the pale light of dawn and the smell of smoke. The fire had burned itself out, but the smoke was still rising, thick and gray, curling in patterns that looked almost like symbols. I stepped out of the tent and froze. The clearing was different. The trees had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The lean was sharper, the twist more pronounced, and the ground was marked with dozens of small indentations, like something had walked in circles around my tent all night. I checked for tracks, but there were none, just those shallow impressions, evenly spaced and too uniform to be animal. I packed quickly, trying not to look at the trees, but every time I glanced up, I swore they were closer. The trail back felt longer than it should have, and the forest didn't let go easily. The air stayed heavy, the silence followed me, and once, just once, I turned around and saw a figure standing in the clearing, tall and still, not moving, not watching, just there. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling remained, like something had marked me, like I'd been noticed. I didn't speak to the ranger on the way out. I just nodded and kept walking, but he looked at me differently, like he knew I'd gone where I wasn't supposed to. That night, back in my apartment, I found something in my backpack I hadn't packed, a small piece of bark, twisted into a spiral, smooth to the touch and warm, like it had been held. I threw it away, but it came back. I found it on my windowsill the next morning, then in my coat pocket, then under my pillow. I stopped camping after that. I stopped hiking. I stopped going near trees. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that scraping sound again, soft and slow, like something remembering me, like something waiting for me to come back. The forest had a way of swallowing sound, and that was the first thing I noticed the night I set up camp along the ridge. How the usual nighttime chorus of insects and distant owls seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I'd hiked farther than planned, chasing the last bit of daylight, and by the time I found a flat patch of ground, the sky had already turned that deep, bruised blue that comes right before full darkness. I pitched my tent, lit a small fire, and tried to settle into the quiet, but something about the air felt wrong, like the woods were listening. The flames flickered in strange patterns, bending sideways even when there was no wind, and every time I looked away, I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. I told myself it was just exhaustion, the kind that makes shadows look like figures and tree trunks look like silhouettes of people standing still. But as the night deepened, the feeling grew heavier, more deliberate, like whatever was out there wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I tried to distract myself by boiling water for tea, but the metal cup rattled against the rock as if something had bumped it, even though I was sitting perfectly still. I scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but dense blackness between the trunks, yet the sense of presence pressed closer, like a cold hand hovering just above my shoulder. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would reset my nerves, but the moment I zipped the tent shut, the forest seemed to exhale, long and slow, as if relieved I was finally contained. Lying there, I could hear the faintest crunch of leaves outside, not footsteps exactly, but a slow, deliberate shifting, like something dragging itself just enough to reposition. I held my breath, listening, counting the seconds between each sound, but the pattern never settled. It was too irregular to be an animal, too intentional to be the wind. At one point, the noises stopped completely, and the silence that followed was so absolute it felt physical, pressing against the tent walls. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the ground, maybe 10 feet from where I slept.
Top, pass it, top, pass it, top.
It wasn't fast or frantic. It was patient, almost curious. I wanted to look, to unzip the tent just an inch, and see what was out there, but something deep in my gut told me not to. The tapping continued for several minutes, then shifted, circling slowly around the tent, each tap landing closer than the last. My heartbeat was so loud, I was sure it could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the tapping stopped. The forest went still again, but this time the silence felt different, expectant. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking up hours later to the faint glow of dawn seeping through the tent fabric. For a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined everything, that the noises were just the forest settling or branches falling. But when I stepped outside, the ground told a different story. The leaves around my tent were disturbed in a perfect circle, cleared away as if something had paced around me for hours. And in the center of that circle, right at the entrance of my tent, was a single smooth stone, placed deliberately, almost ceremonially. It wasn't from the ridge. Its color and texture didn't match anything in the area. I picked it up, and it was warm, as if it had been held in someone's hand moments before I found it. The forest was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way it had been the day before. This quiet felt like a warning, like the woods had allowed me one night, and one night only. I packed up quickly, refusing to look back at the tree line, even though I could feel eyes on me the entire time. As I hiked away, the air grew lighter, the sounds of birds slowly returning, but the weight of that warm stone in my pocket stayed with me, a reminder that some places aren't meant to be visited, and some things in the forest don't want to be seen. They just want you to know they're there. I didn't realize something was following me until long after I'd already walked too deep into the woods to turn back without admitting to myself that something felt wrong, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. Not when the whole point of this trip was to clear my head and prove I could still handle being alone in the wilderness. The first day felt normal enough. Quiet trail, thick canopy, the kind of peaceful isolation I usually crave. But even then, there were moments when the silence felt too complete, like the forest was listening instead of resting. Every now and then I'd hear a faint crunch behind me, just a half beat after my own footsteps, soft enough to dismiss, but steady enough to notice. I told myself it was just sound bouncing strangely between the trees, but the deeper I walked, the more certain I became that the echo wasn't mine. By late afternoon, the feeling of being watched had settled between my shoulder blades like a cold hand, and every time I stopped walking, the forest seemed to stop breathing with me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see another hiker, but the trail behind me was always empty, swallowed by shadows that didn't match the time of day. I reached a clearing just before dusk, a narrow oval of open ground surrounded by tall pines that leaned inward like they were trying to close the space off. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the way the air felt heavier with every passing minute, as if the forest were waiting for something. I built a fire, but the flames burned low and tight, refusing to rise no matter how much wood I added, and the smoke curled upward in a thin, unnatural column that didn't drift or waver. As darkness settled, the feeling of being watched intensified until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my skin. I kept scanning the tree line, convinced I'd see someone standing there, but the only movement came from the shadows themselves, stretching in slow, unnatural ways that didn't match the flicker of the fire. I ate quickly, every bite feeling too loud in the oppressive silence, then retreated into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there listening to the forest breathe around me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, before I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves just beyond the tent. Not an animal, not the wind, something walking, something trying to match the rhythm of my breathing. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It circled the tent slowly, each step measured and patient, like it was studying me, learning the shape of me through the thin nylon wall. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The footsteps paused at the entrance of the tent, so close I could feel the faint vibration through the ground, and for a moment the silence was so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound faded, replaced by a low, steady hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the air like the woods were whispering in a language too old to understand. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to the pale light of dawn and the smell of damp earth. When I stepped outside, the clearing was different. The ground around my tent was disturbed, not with footprints exactly, but with long, shallow impressions that circled the tent in a perfect ring, as if something had dragged its fingers through the dirt over and over. The trees felt closer too, leaning inward at sharper angles, their branches twisted into shapes that looked almost like arms reaching toward the center. I packed quickly, refusing to look at the tree line, even though I could feel eyes on me. The trail felt wrong as I walked, curving in directions it never had before, leading me past trees that looked familiar in the worst way, like I'd seen them from a different angle hours earlier. And always, behind me, just out of sight, I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves, the faint snap of a twig, the quiet exhale of something trying not to be heard. I sped up. It sped up. I slowed down. It slowed down. It never got closer, never fell behind, just stayed at that perfect distance where I could feel it but never see it. By late afternoon, the forest had grown darker even though the sun was still high, the shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd catch a glimpse of whatever was following me, but the trail behind me was always empty, swallowed by a darkness that didn't belong to daylight. When I finally reached the trailhead, the air shifted instantly, lighter, easier to breathe, as if I'd stepped out of a room that had been holding its breath. I hurried to my car, threw my gear inside, and drove without looking back, but even as the forest disappeared in my rearview mirror, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. That night, when I unpacked my bag, I found something tucked into the side pocket, a small piece of bark carved into a spiral, smooth and warm as if it had been held recently. I didn't put it there. I threw it away immediately, but the next morning it was on my kitchen counter, perfectly clean, perfectly centered, waiting. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. I don't go near the woods. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels too still, I hear it again, the soft crunch of leaves behind me, the faint exhale of something that followed me out of the forest and never stopped, something that learned the rhythm of my footsteps and now knows exactly how to match them.